Technically True by Tanay Pan. Hey everyone, welcome to the ninth episode of Technically True. I'm your host, Tanay Pan. In this episode, we will talk about how mastering public speaking can improve our lives and make us a better leader, effectively learning from other speakers, getting started with your first conference talk, and avoiding early stage burnouts. Today I'm joined by Karl Hughes.
Hey, thanks, Tane.
Thanks for joining us. Karl is a software engineer and startup CTO in Chicago. Karl runs CFP Land to help other speakers find opportunities to get on stage and has helped over 1,800 tech speakers through the weekly newsletter, blog posts, and Pro Speaker tool. Something that you probably didn't know about Karl. While he was in engineering college, he once played the ghost of Christmas Future in the play of A Christmas Carol. I really admire that. I once played Mrs. Bennet from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice in high school. Theater is hard.
That's awesome.
A very warm welcome, Karl. Would you like to tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Tane. Yeah, I'm happy to. And your introduction was pretty a good overview, but I've been a software engineer for a number of years, mostly working with early stage startups. A few years ago, I started to get into speaking at conferences. As you kind of mentioned in the intro, I've had a little bit of experience up in front of people. Of course, my role in that play in college was a non-speaking, non-acting role. I was basically hidden underneath a giant, what they call a puppet. It was like this thing they put on my shoulders. So I don't know how much that contributed to me being a good speaker or not. But yeah, so I got into speaking at tech conferences a couple of years ago, and I sort of realized there was a gap to find open CFPs, and we'll get into that as we go. And so I started a website called CFP Land. But other than that, I just had a baby about 14 weeks ago. My wife did, rather. And so I am adjusting to life as a new father as well.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. As we always do, let's start up with a rapid fire round. Are you ready?
Absolutely.
Okay, your favorite DevRel team?
Favorite DevRel team. I am a big fan of the people at, there's two that I'm thinking of, but they're now technically merged. I think Twilio is the one that I see around at a lot of conferences, and I have always loved their product. Sending text messages is a really huge pain, and it's gotten more and more important. They do a good job also of maintaining a lot of SDKs for the different platforms that people write code on. So I see them around, met a couple people there. Don't remember any of their names right offhand, but I know they're doing a good job out there.
Meetups or conferences?
Well, I run my own meetup here in Chicago. It's the Chicago PHP meetup, so I'm going to plug them. But other than that, I've always really enjoyed Midwest PHP. It's kind of a local or regional PHP community conference. And I had a great time last year going to Code Mash, which is a massive conference done in Sandusky, Ohio.
Cool. Favorite tool to build your slides?
I use Google Slides. It's the availability of it, not having to have any specific software downloaded is really attractive, as well as it just kind of working for everything from business slides to presentation slides at a tech conference, etc.
A speaker you learned the most from?
So the person who comes to mind is Nicholas Means. He does these talks. I got to see one of them at the Lead Dev in Austin a couple of years ago, and he does these talks where he kind of walks through the anatomy of a disaster, or in the case where I saw it was the near disaster at 3 Mile Island. And you learn so much from the many small failures that make up a large failure that it was really applicable to what we do all the time in software engineering. It's those tiny little corners you cut all the time that all of a sudden add up to this massive problem. And you almost can't predict those sorts of systemic failures.
The topic that you're most passionate about?
I get really excited lately. This comes and goes in different waves. Lately, I've been really excited about writing less code. I think that the tools that developers have out there today are just orders of magnitude better than even when I started coding 10 years ago. To get software started and built without a ton of custom code. So that's using third-party services and APIs. It's using frameworks that have got so much more mature and easy to use out of the box. It's using high level languages. It makes us so much more productive when we're getting new projects started.
Excellent. This was fun. So, how did you first get started with public speaking?
Yeah, so as I started to move from more of a hands-on engineering role to a management role with the last startup I worked for, I realized that speaking and presenting in meetings was going to be a bigger part of the job. And I've always liked teaching and educating others. I've worked in education technology for a number of years, and I always enjoyed giving talks at like company functions. And so I started to come up with a couple talk ideas, and I actually began speaking by going to meetups and boot camps, developer boot camps, essentially, and giving those as guest lectures. And it was a great way to sort of try things out, to give talks in a way that you had to speak to even these brand new developers, because it sort of means you have to break that topic down to things that anyone could understand, which I think is a really good exercise for speakers. There's a time and place to create a highly technical talk that speaks to a very small subset of people. But for the broad majority of speakers, they have to realize their audience is likely not as knowledgeable about a lot of things that they are. And so they kind of need to start with the basic.
Yeah, makes sense. And what were your biggest hurdles that you personally faced when you got started?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple sides. First of all, when I started speaking at meetups and boot camps, I'm going to combine those into a cool word called meet camps, which is not, not a real word. So I started speaking at meetups and boot camps, and the barrier there was just time to prepare talks. And so each meetup is very different from the next. So you kind of have to have a talk that's tailored for it. So you can't give the same talk at a Node meetup that you can at a PHP meetup, or rarely can you. So that was a very time-consuming process. Doing it talks at the boot camps was actually a little better, because you could sort of give a little broader range of topics. But sometimes it depended on their curriculum and when they wanted you to come in, things like that. Anyway, it was challenging, but as I got a little more practice and I felt more confident, I started to look into speaking at conferences. And I had been to a few tech conferences. I knew that what's called a CFP, a call for proposals or call for papers. And I knew that a conference would basically put out the CFP, and anyone who wanted could theoretically apply to speak at it. I had no idea how hard that was going to be. And so the biggest barrier in when I first started thinking I wanted to speak at conferences was, I know I have to apply to a lot of these things if I want to get a few acceptances, and I have to find a lot of these CFPs. And there were several websites I ended up finding, and Twitter accounts and people I follow, and sort of different places for these CFPs to live. And that ended up sort of spurring the CFP Land project, which was basically just to fill my own need to get a simple list of all the CFPs that I could find and have them sort of emailed to me weekly, so I remember which ones I need to apply for and which ones are coming up soon.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. I regularly use CFP Land, and it's such a big help. Now, Karl, you are currently working as a CTO. So could you maybe tell us a bit about why public speaking is important for leadership?
Absolutely. So one thing I've noticed as I've grown from a hands-on engineer to hands-on sort of player coach to then more managing a team, as I've hit each of those phases, is I do more and more just explaining what it is we're doing and why we're doing it in a professional setting. And so whether that's me explaining to the engineering team what the architectural decision is and why we're going that direction, or me explaining over to the company leadership management team about why a certain project is taking this long, or why we're budgeting this much time for it. In either one of those cases, a lot of the job is basically public speaking, and the ability to digest complicated technical information and sort of put it onto a 5 or 10 slide deck is extremely important in any management role, especially with a startup where you have all sorts of stakeholders, and you kind of end up with this hybrid role where you're doing a ton of different things. So sort of speaking at conferences has I guess, given me some practice in taking a really technical or interesting problem and breaking it down into simple, easy to understand steps, and then walking people through solutions. And that's the same process I kind of go through on a weekly basis when I deliver our product meeting summaries, or on a quarterly basis when I talk about our OKRs for the engineering and product teams. And so it's really helpful to have some of that experience outside of the normal platform that you do that kind of thing, so that you can kind of bring that back. It also makes you sort of turn a lens inward. So for example, a couple of years ago, I was giving a talk on several times on microservices, because the startup I worked for previously used microservices. It was a popular topic at the time. But the more I gave that talk, the more I sort of, I guess, introspected on that decision to use microservice architecture, and the more feedback I got from audience members about why I use it, and sort of hard questions came to me, and I realized that for a lot of startups, that's probably not a good decision. And as I came to the Gray Network, we actually sort of pulled back and used a very like monolithic architecture. And I think that ended up being a really good thing for our case and for our size of team. It's interesting how just giving a conference talk sort of forces you to put this idea out there, and people can critique it, and that helps you do better in the future when you make similar decisions.
Yeah, very true. Like these kind of activities and recognition, I think, elevates a person's standing in any organization. Also, effective public speaking skills can also help with career advancement, right? As they indicate skills and abilities like creativity, critical thinking, or
Mm-hmm.
as you mentioned, distilling information in such a way that you can explain it to other people. Like
Right.
essentially qualities which are very important for the job market.
Right. Yeah, and
So,
that's a good
yeah.
point. You also, well, another thing that comes up often when talking to speakers is the professional profile that speaking gives you. And for me, this has been less. I'm not as concerned with, sort of being top of my field as some people, but for a lot of
Right.
really good developers, I mean, being recognized as a conference speaker is a big part of their identity and how they get jobs, how they meet future employers, and so that shouldn't be discounted at all.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm curious if you have delivered non-technical talks before.
Yeah, so this year I started writing and submitting my first couple non-technical talks. I'm doing one in May, I believe, on writing less code and stepping away from the hands-on engineering work to be more of a manager and to make more decisions and ask why more often. I am really interested, I think, and this is just reflective of where I guess I'm at this point in my career, but I'm really interested in solving real business problems with software. I think a lot of software engineers sort of get into the trap of just because it's cool that they can build it, they should build it. And I think that's often a very distracting problem for businesses. And at the end of the day, we're all paid by employers to write code. And for the most part, there's a few of us probably working on some open source stuff that you can do whatever you want with. But
Yeah.
most of the time, we're making a living by writing software that helps a business move forward in some way. And when you start thinking about that as your frame of reference, it's really makes a big difference in how you approach code problems. Just solving things because they're cool technical problems becomes less of a draw, and instead you're looking at more like, well, what are the business impacts, the company impacts, the customer impacts? How much influence could this make on our future? And those are really end up being the important questions, especially in a small startup.
Right. And I asked this because I remember that the last time we briefly talked, we discussed TED Talks. So do you
Mhm.
think it's harder to deliver non-technical talks as opposed to technical talks?
I think it's just different. So for me, tech
Mhm.
talks kind of follow I guess I know the pattern better. I know the pattern is you present a problem, you present like maybe a couple possible solutions, you present the solution you picked, and then what you learned from it. And a lot of
Yeah.
technical talks sort of follow that same, a very similar pattern.
Mhm.
Uh, but non-technical talks are a little more open-ended. It's a little harder to just present things as problem solution and here's how you can solve it again in the future, because people come into play and no two people are the same. So I could present, people problem up to the world in a talk, a non-technical talk. But at the end of the day, that no two people who I talk about are alike. And so part of the hard part of being a manager, I think, is knowing that people aren't all the same, that they all have different concerns. And I think non-technical talks end up feeling very open-ended because they're a lot of based on personal experience and these complicated issues that are not quite so black and white or quite so if this then that type problems. But they're also a lot of fun, and I think that's why people love watching these TED Talks. They can be so inspiring. They can be so motivating to just get you thinking of things kind of differently because you're hearing someone who's very positive and inspiring give them. And so I've been trying to figure out how to do that a little bit more with talks. Obviously, it's hard because you have to still be relevant to the conference you're applying it. But I think it's something that the best speakers really tend to do is blend in these technical and non-technical topics together.
Yeah, that's true. So you've been working on CFP Land for a while now, and you have interviewed a lot of speakers, and you also built a guide to public speaking. So what are some of the most important takeaways from these collective experiences?
Yeah, I've been running CFP Land for about a year now and interviewed around 35 speakers, I think, give or take. There's a few key takeaways that I have gotten from these interviews and then digesting them into the big guide that I published. So first of all, the most prolific speakers apply to a ton of conferences. This was kind of a surprise. I assumed that I was just new, so I had to apply to a lot of conferences, but even people who have been speaking for years, they still apply to 20, 30, 50 conferences a year sometimes. And they just know that it's a numbers game, and only 10 to 50% of their talks, depends on who it is and how much they've been around, how good they are at it. But 10 to 50% of their talks are going to get accepted. For me, that number's been more like 10 to 15%. Some people it's close to 50%. So there's a bit of luck, but there's also a lot of experience that builds up and reputation that builds up. The other thing that I've learned and sort of come to appreciate more is that we as a tech community really benefit from having a diverse range of speakers. One of the things that's really fun with these interviews has been just hearing the backgrounds of the different people, and they vary quite a lot. There's people who are career changers. So one young woman who used to be like a ballerina and in PR, and she's gotten into technology the last few years. I think she went through a boot camp and now she's speaking at conferences. And so that's such a unique path that I don't know, you couldn't have told me to predict it. There's no way. Yeah. And it's really cool because people from these unique backgrounds end up building that into what they speak about and how they speak, how they make analogies and how they draw other people in. And so I think that's really important and interesting in our industry right now. Another thing that comes up a lot in these interviews is that the best speakers tend to practice a lot, especially earlier on in their career, and they all recommend practicing 10, 15, 20 times before you actually give a talk or as you give a talk, just to get better and better. They recommend being analytical about who your audience is and how you say certain things to certain people. So that's really interesting to take away, because I've also, on the flip side, there are some speakers who have told me they really don't do much practicing and that they're very much an off-the-cuff type speaker. And so the last takeaway I'll kind of throw in here is that I don't think there is a quote-unquote right way to give a conference talk. I think that as a speaker, as someone who wants to speak, someone who's just getting on stage for the first time, you're going to have to try a few things, and sometimes they're not going to work very well for you. Eventually, hopefully, you will find something that does. And so the guide hopefully gives you a few common tips and pointers and things that come up from all these interviews I did. But again, you have to take everything with this big grain of salt that you're going to go do it, and it's going to be a little different. I remember the first time I got on stage and felt really out of place. I was delivering a talk that was very highly technical. I had not done nearly enough looking into who the audience was, and the audience was a lot of people who were more like website administrators and less software developers. And so it was a great talk for the right audience, but not a great talk for the wrong audience. And I remember just looking out into the crowd and seeing so many blank stares. And these people are smart, capable people who know websites. I was talking about this low-level programming stuff that they had no interest or knowledge about. And I felt like, first of all, I felt like a jerk for kind of letting myself do that. Second of all, I felt like a little bit stupid in a way, because it's like, well, I didn't do my homework, which is one of those big things that the best speakers, again, they always point to: know who your audience is. Even when you're writing that pitch for the conference, that CFP, make sure you know who the audience is, but especially before you get on stage. And so that one I had to learn the hard way.
Yeah, that's a very interesting experience. Thanks for sharing that. So a lot of people prefer to give their first talk at meetups, but how to select your first conference? Like what are some of the things that should be kept in mind?
Yeah, so the biggest one I just mentioned was who is your audience and is this the right audience for this talk? A lot of meetups are very tech specific. So, for example, here in Chicago, we have a Node meetup, we have a JavaScript meetup, we have a PHP meetup. All the major frameworks have their own meetups. And these are all sort of a specific niche topic. And so, if you were to try to pitch them a talk that was sort of outside of their niche, it's probably not going to work real well, or it doesn't make a lot of sense. So the first sort of thing to keep in mind is just that know your audience and know that this talk is right for them. And if it's not, make an adjustment to the talk or move on to a different conference or different meetup or whatever it is. The second thing that I found really helpful as I started speaking at conferences, especially, was to scope out the room beforehand. So if you're just used to giving talks at local meetups or like I did with boot camps, then you're probably used to being in a small room that sits maybe 20 to 100 people. And that's fine. It's like not that intimidating. It feels pretty casual, like a conversation, like a big meeting, essentially. But when you get into a conference and if it's a big conference and they have a stage and they have lights and they have a mic, things start to feel very different. I remember the first time I walked on stage and there was, a spotlight on me and I had to stand in the right place on stage to have the
Yeah.
spotlight hit me. And it was intimidating because I'd never been through that before. But B,
Yeah.
it sort of threw me off and I wasn't prepared for it. And so I think the more you can sort of prepare and look at the room, try it out, sit with get in with the lighting person beforehand, see how things are going to look. If you can do all that, you're in a better spot, a little more prepared. You'll feel a little more comfortable up on stage when it happens.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are some good pointers. And something interesting that we talked about when we last chatted was measuring how much to take on, especially when doing public speaking as a side project to make sure that you don't burn out. So, how do you deal with this?
So I found that my acceptance rate is about 10 to 20%, and I had to find that out through trial and error, essentially. The first year I applied to around 50 conferences. I was accepted to 7, and then 6 of those conferences actually happened. One of them just sort of the organizers had to cancel because of things going on outside of my control. So knowing those numbers now is sort of my baseline. I have sort of toned it down to where I try to apply to 10 to 20 a year, and I might speak at 2 or 3, which is a good number for me at this point in my career with all the other things I have going on, family and all that. So I think my recommendation is if you want to start speaking, you probably will have to apply to a lot more in the early days to get just your first few acceptances. If you do
Mhm.
apply to 50 in a year, you probably will get 5 or 10 of those conferences accepting you. So be prepared to give that many talks. I
Yeah.
think one thing that a lot of new speakers can do to help minimize the stress of that is to just only give 1 or 2 talks. So 1 or 2 different talks, but at several conferences. And the reason that's helpful is you only have to do that prep work a couple times. Now you may have to tweak it for each individual conference, but you could at least have like the basic slide deck down and the outline down, and kind of re-give that same talk over and over.
Yeah, that's really good advice because something really common that we hear, and this is advice that's given to new speakers, is to spend through a million CFPs to maximize chance of acceptance. And that makes sense. But something that I've seen happen way too often is that we don't know how good our proposals are. And sometimes one ends up getting invited to maybe 15 or 20 conferences per year. And now fear of missing out or FOMO dictates that we say yes to all of them because it's our first year speaking after
Sure.
all. And this often results in early stage burnouts. So yeah, like any advice on handling fear of missing out?
Yeah, I remember this feeling very well. The first year I got accepted to speak at a conference in Eastern Europe, and
Mhm.
I was so excited to get an international conference in my first year of speaking. It felt like it felt like such a big deal. Of
Yeah.
course, it happened to be the same or a week before another conference that I had just accepted their offer to speak here in the US. And so what it would have meant for me and work and my family would be I would be going to Eastern Europe, for 3 days, and then I would fly back and immediately have to go off to another conference. And as I talked about it with my wife, I was, kind of talking how this will be pretty challenging. And she said, yeah, I don't think you need to do that. And
Yeah.
it was sort of nice because honestly, if I'd been single, I probably would have said yes, and I would have been stressed out about it, and it would have been a tough time, and I would have had to deal with taking off all this time at work. But she sort of like knew that that was going to be a little more than I could handle. So my point is that you don't have to say yes to everything, and it's not going to hurt your reputation. I've declined a conference, and then the next year got accepted again, and I accepted it. So I think that's very common. Conferences understand that you are a human and you have a limit to what you can do, and that you are applying to lots of other conferences. So the ones that know that will try to get you accepted as early as possible so they can kind of be first. But you also have to think about, what is your goal in doing the speaking anyway? Are you, if you're a freelancer and this is how you drum up business, it may be important for you to take every single conference that you can get. That's fine. But if your goal is just to sort of build yourself professionally and get yourself out in the community and help other people learn things, you have to realize that you can't do everything and you can't say yes to everything. So even those speakers who do this professionally as part of their job, they decline conferences all the time. There's nothing wrong with that. And remember that your career is long. You're going to have plenty of time to apply to that conference again, and you'll probably get it again. So just don't worry about it and decide based on what your personal limits are.
All right. Are we missing something, Karl? Anything else that you'd like to convey to our listeners?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I really encourage new speakers, especially, to get out and give it a try. I think our community needs more people with different backgrounds to be up on stage. And so if you are at all interested in learning a little more about the process, feel free to go to CFP Land and check out the guide that we have published there, as well as the newsletter. Or my inbox is always open. I'm at Karl L. Hughes on Twitter. And you can reach me also at karl@cfpland.com.
Thanks for joining us today, Karl.
Yeah, thanks, Tane.
And thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Technically True. I'm at @Tane1337 on Twitter, and I would love to know what you'd like to listen in the next episode. Until then, auf Wiedersehen. You have been listening to Technically True, a podcast about public speaking, developer relations, and technology, hosted and produced by Tane Pan.